Welcome everybody. My name is Lisa Hasker from Vicsport for another 20 days. It's great to see so many people here today. I'm going to introduce you to Erin Trebley from SRV in a minute to talk a bit about why we're here today, but it's wonderful to see lots of old friends and lots of new sports as well, getting ready for June 2027. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present. It's great to see, as I said, so many of you, some people coming in pairs with their sports, so you'll be tackling this together. We are lucky enough to be working with SRV on our inclusion plans, our gender equity plans, which we're looking at today. And also, starting in the new year, we'll be looking at reconciliation action plans for bigger sports and First Nations policies for smaller sports, so watch out for that. But can I introduce Erin Trebley from SRV to give a bit of context, and then I'll introduce our facilitator for today.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for coming along. I know we're all kind of limping towards the end of the year, and it's been a really big and long year, so December is crazy. So thank you all for making the effort to come along to this session. Just for some context around the requirement for future TMA to have inclusion action plans, gender equity action plans, and First Nations strategies / RAPs, which I'm just going to refer to them as plans from here on in without rattling that off every time. So for those of you that are currently funded under TMA, Together More Active, again, if you're not funded, if you're not aware of what that acronym is, in your funding agreement, you have committed to developing these plans by June 2027. It was also in the TMA guidelines, but we do, being government, tend to bury that stuff, so it might not have been super obvious. So moving forward, whatever the next iteration of TMA may be, we don't know what that's going to look like yet. Obviously, we'll go through an evaluation process and potentially redesign or rejig the program a little bit. But it will be a requirement to be eligible for the next iteration of TMA to have these plans in place. So that is the context behind this. Obviously, the new TMA won't start till June 2027, so you do have some time, and this is why we're just working with Vicsport and Ryan, and later on there'll be support around RAPs and First Nations strategies as well for you guys to develop that. Obviously, those of you that receive foundation funding, you can use your foundation funding that you have through to June 2027 to support the development of these plans for your organisation. But I know a lot of you have already started, and a lot of you already have at least one of them in place. Just some other context around why we are asking you guys to have this. So one of the key aims and objectives of TMA is inclusive participation. So it's great for you guys to have an inclusion action plan that can support the delivery of the projects and you apply for funding for, rather than, so we can really see where it fits in your organisation and your strategic objectives. So a couple of the team are here today. We could be down the back on the admin table. If you need us at any point, just pop down and ask a question, but otherwise I'll just hand back to Lisa.
Thanks, Erin. Now I get to introduce a wonderful human who's going to take... I'm going to read the bio because he said, oh, don't read all of it because it's, but I'm going to do it anyway. Just because I can. I'm doing a few things as I wander out the door. Might spend all the money. Might sign up a few new partners. We'll see what happens as we go. The poor board. So we are lucky enough to have worked with Ryan Storr for... as long as I've been at Vicsport, 7.5 years, which has been fantastic on various projects. There's no one better to take you through this process and help you design these plans. We'll be working with Ryan on the inclusion and gender equity side of the plans, and then a separate group on the reconciliation action plans and First Nations policies. We'll start that process in the new year. Let me read this so I get it right. Dr Ryan Storr is a globally recognised academic, consultant and practitioner specialising in diversity, equity and inclusion within sport and movement settings. He's the founder of the Diversity Storr, that's Ryan's company, and the co-founder of Proud to Play, which we also are very lucky to work with. Through his consultancy, the Diversity Storr, Ryan advises government departments, elite sport bodies and community organisations on inclusive policy development, strategic planning, education and impact evaluation. His work includes collaborations with international tennis organisations such as Tennis Australia, the United States Tennis Association and most recently SAIL GP. So we're very lucky to have Ryan to coach all of us on how we can produce our plans, because they're obviously going to be slightly different for each of our sport and rec organisations. So welcome Ryan.
Excellent. I think we're in business. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So that intro is just to give you some confidence that I know what I'm talking about, mainly. But I'm going to spend the next few hours basically guiding and coaching you on how to do your commitment to this specific body of work, but more importantly, kind of an overarching DEI policy, because obviously you've got different areas and aspects to your work, but I would advise that you need a broad DEI strategy and approach and policy, and then these aspects will kind of work underneath them. So although you've got your three different things, we're going to kind of work towards a more broader piece. And it's important because some of you might have policies and things that you've done already, but they could have been developed 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And we're in a very different social and political climate right now, especially with the attacks on diversity that are happening. So you do need to be a bit more strategic. Especially when you might not have funding, resources and people to actually do the work, or you might be a volunteer doing this work. Just want to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're here on today, pay my respects to elders past and present. So just to give you an idea about what's on our agenda, I'm going to start with an activity, so it's going to be a bit interactive. You're going to have some discussions. I'm not just going to stand and talk at you for 2 hours. I'll give you a bit of an overview of the current climate and some of the research that I've been doing in particular, especially in sport. We'll have a break, and then we'll look at the roadmaps and action plans, and then we're going to finish on an activity where you'll have some discussions about thinking about what are the minimum standards of inclusion. So one thing that I see in the work that I do is that sometimes organisations try and do too much, and they're saying they want to conquer the world, which is excellent, but they're not really sure how to do it, and they don't evaluate it or do research, so they don't know if they've actually achieved it. So I think it's really important to think about what's that kind of idea of a minimum standards and some low-hanging fruit, so that if people are playing your sport or in your organisation, what are the minimum commitments your sport can make to ensure that they're included and have this sense of safety as well. So I mentioned, or Lisa mentioned, one of my clients has been SailGP, which has been a really interesting organisation to work with. That was from a Sydney event I went to last year, and kind of just summed up well. So 2 quotes: "A smooth sea never made a skillful sailor. We can't direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails." So the current climate around diversity, it's not necessarily easy. I've been doing this about 15 years, and it's probably one of the most challenging times that I've personally experienced trying to navigate this work, especially with attacks and things. And obviously in America, there's a big kind of backlash, and Donald Trump has actively signed orders to inhibit DEI, and often organizations who have maybe American owners, they've had to kind of work through how that impacts Australian-based companies as well. So it is a difficult time. Unfortunately, sport kind of is in the media a bit when some of these issues play out, because sport kind of has that currency. So for those maybe against it, they can kind of leverage sports to get their point across. And sometimes you kind of have to adjust your policies and the things that you're doing. So for example, you might design a great diversity project or gender equity plan, but it actually, you find it's not having the impact, or it's not doing what you're wanting to do. So you just have to kind of address it and slightly change it. And it's one thing that kind of a takeaway from today is you will have to navigate some tricky ground. So you might have a policy, or you might have some things happen. It's not going to be easy. It's not just going to go plain sailing. You are going to have to adapt. So when you do have these policies and action plans, use them as guides, because you will kind of probably have to go off script a little bit, because sometimes there might be things that happen that you can't control, whether that's government policy or resistance from pockets of your sporting community, for example. And as working in the LGBT space, that's been very challenging over the last couple of years. So we're just going to start with a little activity just to get you thinking about what you or your organisation currently has around diversity, equity, inclusion. So in terms of terminology as well, just so you kind of clear, it often changes, but diversity, equity, inclusion is kind of the broad concept around including people from marginalised backgrounds. So diversity is the amount of social difference that we have in a sport or organisation. Equity are the things that we need to do to make people feel included or to give people access, because they don't always have access. And inclusion is, once you've got those people and those participants in your sport, what can you do to include them and keep them there so they feel that sense of inclusion? You might also see now belonging is a new concept some sport organisations are using, and it's kind of like a broad catch-all piece. Sometimes diversity in some organisations and American colleagues, you can't use the word diversity if you want funding, so you have to be proactive. So it might be about inclusive cultures or organisational culture. It's completely up to you and where your organisation is at, depending on if it's a male-dominated sport where you have a lot of men participation and on your organisation, for example. It might be that you need to be strategic about how you design and call your program, because we know there is increased kind of backlash amongst men and young boys in particular around gender equity. So how you kind of call it, I'll leave that for you, but DEI is still the kind of language, but it says what it does on the tin. So what I would like you to do first of all is you have some sticky notepads on your desk. So I want you to think about either, and there's different options for you. You can either think about your sport that you're involved in, your organisation, so if you work for a state sport organisation, or you're a board member and you want to think just about your board. It's completely up to you. But I want you to think about how you would describe diversity, equity, inclusion, or diversity, or the culture towards diversity in your organisation. And I want you to do that and reflect on it using fruit and vegetables. Now, I've done this exercise a few times, and I'm always really fascinated to hear what people say. Some people can be ruthless. But I want you to think about how you would describe the culture towards DEI or the culture of diversity within your organisation. Think about where your sport and where it is on its DEI journey. Do you do a lot? Do you do nothing? Are you just starting your journey? Do you have a commitment but you don't have any direction? What's your current engagement like? Is it reactive? Is it just tick box? Or is it meaningful, authentic, and impactful? And I want you to think about the full range of colours, whether it's bright or dull, the smell, whether it's fresh or it's rotten, for example, or smelly, the taste, whether it's sour or sweet, or all the different ranges, the flavours, spices and sweetness, etc. I really want you to, I think it's the left part of the brain you use for this activity. I really want you to think about, your own organisation or your sport in general. Right, we'll just hold it there. Do we have any volunteers who would like to share their fruit or vegetable? And you don't necessarily have to say where you're from, just in case. Perfect. Thank you, Tanya. You can kick us off. Just because we're online as well, just if we can speak into the microphone.
Tanya from Netball Vic. I've said grapes. I feel as an organisation, we are probably at a point where I was visualising different grapes on a bunch, that we're a whole bunch of, the bunch is the organisation, and we have everyone as a grape that's part of that organisation. And I said, I feel like we're quite, I suppose, with all the programs and different things that we're doing and keep developing, that we are generally at what I said, like a sweetness of a grape, but every now and then you get a sour grape, and that might be, you know, a challenge you have that happens and comes in. That might be internally with, you know, a staff member that's not on board with things, or it might be something that's happened in the media, or, you know, etc. So I said every now and then there's a sour grape that might be part of that bunch, but I've said generally I feel like, yeah, we're a bunch of grapes, generally at a sweet spot with those grapes.
Perfect. What a great description. Anybody else? Yep. And then we've got one at the front.
Hi, Billy from volleyball Vic, but my sort of response was in regards to our volleyball community anyway, and I didn't actually necessarily pick a fruit. I picked us as fruit salad. We are so fruit salad, you know. We are sweet, we are spicy, we are colourful, we are delicious. There is some sour as well. That's the nature of everything too, but we're an eclectic mix, and we, you know, it's a real celebration of fruit.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's a really good point you make as well, because often there might be great culture and attitudes at certain levels, but then it gets to a highest level and then maybe you get seen. This one work? Yeah. Okay. Testing? Yeah, we're back. Yeah, thank you. Hello? Yeah. Yeah, you make a really good point there as well, because, for example, you could have, you could design the best program. You go to senior leader and they won't pay for it, or they won't give you resources. So sometimes it's hard to crack trying to get senior leaders on board, for example. So yes, that was really great. Really good to hear the different kind of reflections. And hopefully one thing you'll take away from it, it's not just a simple thing. You can have multiple things about it. You can have actually really good programs, but sometimes they might not land. Things might not appear to be what they are. For example, with the LGBT space and trans athletes in particular, there's so much misinformation and factually incorrect information out there. Things don't always appear what they are because they're not. But this is a really good little activity just to get yourself and maybe other people in your organisation. So when you're doing your plans, maybe there's a senior leaders or you're doing an activity, you could do this activity to think, well, how does everyone else feel? Because it's really interesting sometimes when you might have people from the same organisation and one person's like, it's a shiny red apple, we look good, but then we've got a rotten core and it's stale and things like that. And then you've got someone in the same organisation saying, no, it's great, it's sweet, everything's perfect. And it's like, well, there's different perspectives here, so how can we kind of understand what people are actually thinking? So there's lots of different reasons as to why you should be doing this work, but there's also a lot of reasons why you must be doing this work, whether it's from a human rights perspective, legal obligations, growing your sport. There's lots of different things, but as someone who's been doing this for a while, I can tell you that there is always something in the media, regardless if it's a small sport, a big sport. I recently had a very busy time with the ongoing AFL and homophobia stuff, which kept me busy for about 3 months. There's always something. So even if you kind of think, and you might have really good practices and a culture, something could come up. So it's always really important to kind of have action plans and how you respond to incidents, because, and unfortunately I've seen it, a sport is doing really good work, they're committed, I would argue it's really authentic, and then they get a bad media article or controversy and everyone paints them with a brush that they're homophobic or racist and things like that, and it's not a service to actually how the organisation is. So the media is a really tricky kind of one to navigate, but ultimately there is always something. And I did a project, which I'll kind of talk about later on, with some colleagues when I was working at Swinburne University, and it was with Reconciliation Australia, and we did an evaluation of the RAP program. So what was the impact of RAPs on an organisation? And I remember one of the things that stood out to me was we had 3 different sectors that we used in the study. So we had sport and leisure, travel, like Qantas and things, and then Wesfarmers and big kind of supermarket organisations. One thing they kind of said was, look, if we have a scandal or something happens from Wesfarmers or Coles Group or something, it doesn't really reach the media, or it's not on the front page. Whereas if it happens in sport, it's the front page and the back page. So whether it's a good or a bad thing, sport can't escape some of these things. And on the one hand, we know sport can be a certain amount of things. Sport can change the world, it can heal, it can do all these positive things, but it can also actually do negative things, and it can be used to advance agendas or to try and exclude people or take the rights away from certain groups and limit their opportunities to participate in sport and lead healthy lifestyles. So these are just some of the kind of things that happen, whereas it's increased abuse, especially online, misogyny towards women athletes. So we see the football, for example, soccer, with the World Cup and things like that, they've got more exposure, but coming with that, we see a lot more attacks and online abuse towards them. Pride rounds, there's always kind of issues. There's always something happening. So if I could kind of leave you with one thing to take away from today, it would be have a solid action plan and strategy, and maybe a PR and comms piece, because I don't think there's many things that I could think about that wouldn't come up. Like, I've heard and seen everything. So you can kind of prepare yourself for that. If it happens, this is what you do. This is how you respond. And it kind of puts you on the front step. So I'll be sending these slides around as well, so don't worry about taking too many notes. So what is the current state of play? So the first thing I would kind of say is that DEI is under attack. It doesn't matter what group, the different areas of diversity are either resisted or under attack. We're seeing it in the US. Fortunately, we're seeing it in the UK as well, where they're changing definitions and things. It's kind of happening across the globe. And I think Australia is in a quite unique position with the current political and social climate that diversity is and can flourish. But it's not to say that couldn't change. For example, whether it is in Victoria with the state election, could have a change of government, everything could change. Like, we don't know about those type of things. So that's why it's kind of good to have things in place so that you can change and move if you need to. But one of the things I would say is that DEI under attack. There are people who use sport as a platform to try and stop people having rights. As someone in the LGBT space, it happens all the time. Trans people are being excluded. There's people who argue like we shouldn't do pride rounds, we don't need to put it in people's faces, all those type of things. In America, there's been the rise of anti-disability rhetoric and autism and those type of things. Even women, there is still a large pushback around, for example, quotas or gender equity, and we're seeing it in corporate Australia, but also sport. So I think that's quite unique in the respect that people shouldn't have to fight to be included or to play sport. And I think when we have that, we need work to happen, and we need to think about what we can do as sports organisations to remove those barriers. For example, I did a big study last year with Vic Health, when I was a Vic Health Research Fellow, and it was looking at LGBT participation rates in sport and physical activity, and it was around half of LGBT young people participate in sport and physical activity, but also around 53% witness or experience homophobia. So out of half of all young people who identify as queer or LGBTIQ+, they will go into a sport club and have a 50% chance of seeing or witnessing discrimination and homophobia. All it takes is one incident for them to be switched off, and they will never return to sport. That's why it's really important that, and I kind of jump into here, yes, you need to do inclusion, but you have to fight exclusion. Because the main reason why people don't play sport or engage from diverse backgrounds is because they don't feel welcome, they're excluded, or they're made to feel different, or given special treatment, but in a negative way. So I think over the last couple of years in particular, from my perspective, I've seen a lot more efforts to be inclusive and work in inclusion, which is absolutely needed, but you can't just have inclusion without fighting exclusion. And an example, I think, why it's kind of happened in the AFL is because maybe they've done some steps around inclusion, but they haven't made any efforts to tackle homophobia. So you're still going to have homophobia next year, and I'll still be doing media interviews unless you actively try and stop or reduce it. So I think one thing that needs to happen in your plan is an active strategy for how you are going to handle and deal with discrimination. I'll give you another example. We got some funding at Swinburne from the Adidas Foundation, where we're developing an AI large language model to help community sport volunteers respond to discrimination. So we're doing a case study with Yarra Junior Football Club. We're working with the league and then individual football clubs across that league. One thing we found is that discrimination is very common still, but there aren't really any reporting mechanisms for it. And if something happens, what does a volunteer do? Do they get a ban? Do they stop play? Do they console the person? It's all a very grey area. And what we're finding is that there's a chronic underreporting of incidents because the volunteers and administrators don't really know how to handle it, so nothing kind of gets done. And then what happens is discrimination becomes normalised, and it's just part and parcel of playing sport. And we need to kind of move away from that, and we need to think, if something does happen, what do we do? Do they get a 3-week ban? There's lots of different options, but you need to have something in place. And that's why policy is really important, because if something happens, you can revert to the policy, check what the policy states, and you can deal with it. But again, the problem is that not many sports sometimes have those policies. You might have a member protection policy, but sometimes it's 15 years old and it doesn't actually adequately do what you want it to do. So it might be that you have a broad DEI policy, And I'll discuss that later because I've worked with Play by the Rules and we've got templates. So you can download it and get it done. The other thing is the need for strong data to shape match play or how your organisation kind of works. So unfortunately, I still see organisations will kind of have a few conversations, they'll put their thumb in the air and think, what's going to stick? Right, we'll do this. If you're designing a DEI strategy and inclusion plan, it needs to be strategic, it needs to be purposeful, it needs to be relevant to your organisation. You can't just copy and paste you've seen something. And with that, yes, you need to do your 5 different areas, for example, of inclusion, so disability, multicultural, LGBT, gender, First Nations. So you've got those 5 things that you have to do. You can't do 3 and just say, we're going to do 3. Inclusion doesn't work like that. You have to include everybody. But it might be that, for example, 1 or 2 years, you choose to do more or have a more in-depth approach to, for example, all abilities and LGBT. And the year after, you could say, we're going to do more and target more multicultural communities. Okay? So you can be strategic. And every sport is different. So let's just, cricket, for example, I've done a lot of work and continue to have a lot of people from South Asian backgrounds. So that's kind of their bread and butter. So they might have more programs or things happening in that space. It doesn't mean that they only do that, but you can be strategic depending on if you're in a regional area or netball, for example, you're more women dominated. So you might have more programs targeted to women and girls, for example. But you need to be strategic and you need to try and use data. So look at participation data. Who's playing? Who's not playing? There's Ozplay data. Rochelle Imey I've collaborated with as well. She has a lot of participation data around kind of who's playing and things like that. So there's good data out there. You must use it to design the work that you're doing. Because it'll help decide decision making. But I still kind of continue to be a little bit shocked when I ask why people are doing approaches, and I'll give you another example. So LGBT inclusion is kind of my bread and butter. There's lots of different ways that you can engage with that area of diversity. If you jump straight to doing a pride round, that could work for some people. But for the majority, it isn't. And for example, me personally, football or rugby, AFL, an AFL pride round for men might not be the best thing yet, because actually it might happen and it might cause more backlash and more resistance, and it actually could put LGBT athletes in a bit more of a precarious position. So you need to do what is right for your organisation. Just having some conversations at the front, whether you're, for example, a peak body for disability or LGBT, you then have to think about, as an example, people with disabilities. How can we engage and cater to LGBT people living with disabilities, or people with a disability from a migrant background? So there's that intersectionality piece. I won't go too much into intersectionality today, but I'm going to finish with so the Australian Sport Commission designed a intersectionality governance framework, and it's around how organisations can kind of adopt intersectionality, so different areas of diversity from a governance perspective. I'll show you that at the end, because yes, you're going for TMA funding, but it might be that you go for Playwell funding from the Australian Sport Commission. There's lots of different funding opportunities available. So if you can show that you're engaging and you're responding to the different policy imperatives, whether it's a VicGov as well, or your sport, then you can use that to your advantage. The other thing to think about as well is that some colleagues do some research. General society still looks to sports organisations for leadership on these type of issues, diversity issues. So I think there we have charities are the most trusted, public health, public education, justice and sport at 31%. So a lot of people are looking to sport for answers and how to behave. And I know I've had many conversations over the years with sports organisations, and it's like, we're not a social service organisation. We're here to deliver competitive sport to produce winners, okay? That's okay to some degree, but I don't believe in that. It's not just about competition. Most people play sport for friendship, health, and fun. The actual amount of people who are like the competitive elite, it's very important, but it can't drive your whole sport, because if you don't have community and grassroots and volunteers, then you're not going to have the sport. So if anyone questions you doing this work around sport should just stick to sport, we shouldn't be doing sport and politics, that's just not the case, because it does. And I think some examples, for example, the Voice to Parliament and marriage equality debate, a lot of things that we heard was you can't on one hand say, we welcome everybody, we want you to play our sport, but then the next week say, but we don't support you having these basic rights. And yes, it's complicated, it might not be as easy as that, but that's how diverse communities see it. They need to feel supported and respected. So you can't on the one hand say one and do another. So that's why sport and politics and social change absolutely go hand in hand. One quick case study that I just want to give you some confidence around doing this kind of journey and endeavour. I've done two big projects, one for the Australian Open and one for the US Open, so the Grand Slam. So two of the biggest sporting events on the global scale. They have very active DEI portfolios. So they have it from the workforce perspective, and for example, they have Pride Day, All Abilities Day, First Nations Day in America. They have celebrating historically black colleges and loads of other different areas of diversity as well. I did two big evaluation pieces to understand the impact of those pieces of work and that body of work on fans, so what fans think about it, and what the impact is on diverse communities. From an Australian Open perspective, each year the AO has increased its DEI over the course of the last 5 years. So they've raised the bar and they've produced more things, whether that's from a disability perspective, having quiet rooms in certain venues, on the Pride Day, doing activations with families and things like that. They've increased it. And every year, the attendance and the overall kind of market has gone up. So there's strong evidence to show that if you execute and engage with DEI from a data-driven perspective, good things will happen. There's no evidence to show this go woke, go broke approach, so that if you engage with diversity, everything will fall to pieces and you won't be able to operate. I've never seen any evidence for that. The only evidence I do have is when a sport tries and executes something without doing it properly. And it might harm them for a short term, but it's not necessarily going to ruin them long term. So this idea that if you engage with diversity, your organisation will be worse off, there's absolutely no evidence for that to happen. If anyone has it, please send it to me so I can have a look. But all the data suggests, and the research shows, that if you do diversity properly, you'll increase brand authenticity, you'll get more fans through the door and in the gates, you'll have a diverse workforce, you'll have more participants as well. So even if there are concerns around we're just doing political correctness, correct and argue the case, it's a good business decision. A sport organisation is a business. If you want to survive in the modern world, you have to engage with diversity, because diversity is reflective of society. And if you only choose to do a narrow thing, you're missing out of opportunities to get more people playing in things. And it's not just the physical aspect. For example, if you've got a product and you have stadiums, you might have people wanting to watch on the television. You might have people posting on social media. It's all a positive thing that helps your sport. And I think there has been some successful lessons, for example, Formula One with the documentary and things. That's been a really successful thing, and they've had the Pride Hub. They've been a sport that has really kind of seen engaging with diversity from a business perspective has positive impacts. For anyone who's been to Vietnam, I went last Christmas for the first time. Wonderful country. Nearly got killed crossing the road. But when I went on a tour, they said, "Oh, have you crossed the road okay?" I said, "Oh, funny you should say that." No, he said, "Don't worry, just need 2 tips. Don't stop and don't run." And that is exactly the same advice I would give you for diversity. So don't run. Don't go from A to Z. And one example from some of the colleagues I have at the IOC around trans athlete policy and that kind of area is that absolutely committed to kind of doing the right thing. But I think especially with the international organisations, the feedback was they tried to take them from A to B too fast and it put them offside and then it kind of led to resistance and the ban. Exactly the same. If you're at the start of your journey or you're at the middle, wherever you are, you need to bring people along slowly and you can't try and fast track it. And that's what we've seen sometimes with like pride rounds where people have refused to wear jerseys and things like that, Guernseys, is that they kind of try and go too fast. Right, we're doing a pride round, X, Y, and Z. It's happening in 2 weeks. Like, you can't rush diversity. You need to take it slowly and do it for the right reasons. So don't rush it. Bring people along. And I've seen many occasions where I've developed policies. It's been great. And then it's taken to the board and the board rejected it. So then how do you bring board members along, for example? How do you appeal to getting it across the line? And then, what have I said? Don't rush, don't stop. Diversity is not something that you do for 2 or 3 months and then come back to it. You need to keep going. So you could have a 5-year strategy. When it gets to the end of the 5 years, you need to assess, evaluate. Has it worked? So if you've invested $2 million, for example, in a range of diversity initiatives, can you be confident that you've had a return on it? Has the culture changed? Do you have more women in leadership positions? Do more LGBT people play your sport? Like, you need to have that idea because, unfortunately, I see it a lot. Too many programs and initiatives and money is thrown at problems to try and fix it without actually having an impact on the problem. And we saw that sometimes with the reconciliation action plans. Some people had 118 different things on their plan. They might have achieved 20. You don't need to do too much, but if you're trying to work towards reconciliation or reduce anti-racist attitudes in your organisation, has that rap or has that work had an impact on it? Because most of the time people don't know. And that's where, from a board perspective, governance could be argued as a kind of waste of resources if you're just trying to throw money at something without actually trying to have a strategic impact. And it's not to say, because I'm aware that there's many volunteer organisations, volunteers. You don't need to commission a university to do a $200,000 project. You could have some basic evaluation criteria that you can personally track to give you an indication of whether something's hitting the mark or not. Because that's where, if it does have a great impact, you can be like, this is working. Let's invest more resources to it. If something is not hitting the mark and it's actually rubbing people up the wrong way, you can say, right, we need to change direction, for example. Yep. So if people didn't hear that, is that not basic change management and a kind of post-analysis event? Unfortunately, it just doesn't happen. I see it all the time. Because one thing I'm trying to kind of encourage within the sector is basic evaluation methods of diversity. Because let's just say if somebody does a gender equity initiative and is really successful, we want the sector to know, why was it successful? How can we share that information? Because the other thing with this work is you don't need to create anything shiny and new. You need to do what works for your organisation. So you don't need to do anything too outlandish. Kind of use what we know, but sometimes that's why these projects aren't always evaluated or researched properly. So it makes it difficult to actually understand, well, hey, how do you actually get people on board? You need to make a big change. How do you introduce a change? What language do you use? because even language has been shown. Some things could be packaged exactly the same, but the different words are packaged slightly differently, and they have completely 3 different outputs. That's kind of the way some of it goes. The other thing I really want to highlight from all the major research projects I've been doing recently, especially with the tennis projects, is around authenticity. So if your organisation or sport plans something or designs a strategy and there is no authenticity about it, it won't land well. People do not like it. They would much rather you do something small and meaningful than do something, and we see it in the Pride space a lot, where people slap a rainbow on or they engage in a round and they don't do anything else, and it's just not authentic. They don't mean it. So the authenticity piece is really important, because that's a big standout from all the interviews that we did in the US and here. It needs to be authentic. And that's why you need to have diverse groups part of the decision-making project. Like, for example, there was a big hoo-ha in the UK recently, or maybe it was 6 months ago, where they did advertising, and I think it was Heinz ketchup. And they had lots of different scenarios and pictures and small videos that were on commercials. And I think one of them was a black person with loads of ketchup around their mouth, which was not a great image. And then there was another one around a wedding table, and it was a black family, but the dad wasn't there. And there was a lot of pushback because there's lots of stereotypes and tropes that black men aren't around growing up for young people. They didn't do any sense checking or engage, because if they'd have shown that to some black people, they'd have been like, hey, this is not going to work. And I still see it. People are not engaging diverse communities as part of the process. You must. It will not work if you don't speak. And one of the takeaways from today before the next session is that you do some stakeholder engagement, or you speak to some of your fans, players, coaches from diverse backgrounds to understand, hey, how are you currently feeling? Well, actually, I love the sport, but I've been having problems with my coach, or X, Y, or Z. You need to check in and have that understanding. Because I think some people will be surprised knowing they think everything's okay, but then actually they engage with the community and they don't feel supported, for example. Just a short video. Hopefully we get some sound. If not, I will improvise. But this is just a little meme that I want you to have a little look at. Look. Anyway, well, look, it is funny, but ultimately... Hold it there, because you might not be able to hit the back, but ultimately... Just saying, welcome, we love games, everything wrong. And look, Pride space around Pride Month, so people will engage and they'll be like, hey, we love everybody, but then July the 1st come round and it's back to... Yeah, literally. So that's a little funny one, I think, because sometimes that's literally how something... Right, just before we break, just going to go this quickly. I'm getting a bit of feedback. Oh, perfect. Great. So, this is just my personal advice around this. You could be a state sport organisation, and you could have an approach that was, we have a national sport, they have a diversity policy and an execution strategy, we're just going to copy it. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Every state and territory is different. The funding, the governance, everything is kind of different. So you would still need to tweak it to make sure that it's relevant to your organisation. With these three particular pieces of work, they're relevant for the TMA funding. So that's one aspect. There are many other things, and ultimately you still want a strategy for your sport, not just for the purpose of getting funding, but to get more participants and players and diverse board members, etc. So I would always suggest to have a broad DEI strategy and approach. So how is your sport for the next 5 to 10 years, for example, going to try and attract new people from diverse audiences, but also for those who are playing or coaching or volunteering or administrating, how are you going to keep them, especially if they're from diverse backgrounds? Because retention is a big one and it doesn't really get addressed. And a lot of sports lose people, especially teenagers, because there aren't any retention strategies. So you need to think about how you're going to be diverse. And it's not necessarily easy, but you need to have an approach. So the first stage that I would suggest is you need a commitment. 2 parts of this commitment. Obviously written, senior leader commitment, but resources. So ideally, the most successful DEI initiatives or programs, cultures, have resources allocated. That could be money, it could be manpower or person power or people who are willing to do the work, or it could just be written commitments. And I'll give you an example. When I first started Proud to Play, we had no money. We achieved a lot, and we didn't do it off any financial backing. So you can do a lot of work without money. You don't necessarily need funding. Yes, it helps, but you don't need it. Which sport did I work with? Triathlon? Lacrosse, sorry. Worked with Lacrosse Victoria. They didn't have any money or funding. There's only maybe 6, 7 people in the sport. Worked with Kristen, and they wanted to engage in the LGBT space. We started with nothing, but we went out, we did community engagement, and then we got a Vic Health grant, and now they have a very successful kind of Pride initiative that happens every year, and they have initiatives across the major universities to try and attract LGBT people to play across university campuses. They're a great example of using a will and a commitment to want to do the work, and positive things happen. But ideally, you need the commitment, because if you just have a few people at the grassroots and it's not supported by senior leaders, it makes it very difficult. So if your senior leaders aren't involved, it's hard. After this session, I'm going to send you some resources from all the things I'll talk about, templates and things like that. One of them is a big research report I just did, which is publicly accessible, around exploring DEI across the leisure and aquatic industry. So we did a very large study across the whole ecosystem, all the major providers, council facilities. We went out to leisure facilities all over Victoria. And one of the key findings was that there's an assumption that senior leaders in the industry don't support diversity, which is one of the challenges. So senior leaders need to be on board and understand and support the work. If you don't, one of the primary things I would suggest is to try and get that commitment, or think about how you can develop a business case that will speak to them in their language, for example. But someone who works in this space, it's very difficult to get anything done without having support and commitment. The second one is assess. So do an audit and assessment, or commission some research to understand, where are we at? What are we currently doing? Where are our gaps? And that could be broad, but one thing I would always suggest as well is around the legal obligations. So as part of the Equal Opportunity Act, it's illegal to prevent someone or stop someone from playing or accessing a good or service, which is a sport club, from participating. So if you don't do a duty of care, or there are things that happen that stop people, you can be liable because you're negligent under the Equal Opportunity Act. So there are basic things, whether it's child safeguarding as well, that you need to be compliant. Again, it's not really just a nice to have anymore. You do have legal obligations. Design. So once you've done an assessment and you work out what you need to, where your gaps are, what you need to do, you need to create the policies, programs, and processes. So policies is really important because when you enact something and you try and do something, you need to have a policy to fall back on. I see it a lot of times when there's issues of discrimination, etc. It's like, what do we do? How do we respond to it? They don't have a policy to fall back on. So you must have a policy. I'll share afterwards, but I did some templates for play by the rules. So whether you're a club or an organisation, you can download a template, fill it out, and you have your own DEI policy. Again, look at your programs. What are you going to do? How are you going to engage people? Are you going to apply for some funding, whether it's the VicGov Access All Abilities or something, or Movember, trying to engage young boys, for example, and gender-based violence. There's lots of different avenues and approaches you can do in funding streams. The fourth one is education. So you must educate your workforce, your fans, volunteers, yes, around diversity, but also why are you doing it? So suddenly you're rolling out something, or there's going to be new measures around anti-discrimination, and if you discriminate against someone, you're going to be banned from the sport or something like that. You need to say, what's led to this? How have you come to that decision? I think often people kind of will design stuff or make statements, but don't have the support. For example, we're seeing with like integration between men and women in sports clubs. There's so many stories about women being treated abhorrently. There was one where there was a football team, they were running out and they were kicked up. They were kicked and tripped up and stuff when they're running out onto the field. There's things that people don't realise around, like anti-racism, for example, and Voice to Parliament. There's been a sharp increase in racism towards First Nations people since the Voice to Parliament, and that's playing out in sport. So I think it's really important to educate people around, yes, why you're doing it, but what the kind of current state of play is for diverse communities. And it's not easy for them to just go down and play sport, for example, when you might be questioned or discriminated against. Embed. So this is where you integrate and embed DEI initiatives into everyday practices. So it's not just a once a year thing or a International Women's Breakfast with cupcakes. It's how can you actually embed it so it becomes part of the DNA of the institution. So that the end game for diversity is that it's institutionalized and it's part of everyday business. So you don't have, for example, somebody from the workplace asks somebody a question about diversity and they say, oh, that's their job, they're the DEI manager. You can actually answer it because diversity is what everybody does and everyone's part of it, and you can kind of respond to it. It doesn't just fall to one person. Yes, they might lead the programs, but it's not just in a box with one person. It's part of everyday business. And a good example, one of my big clients is Tennis Australia and the Australian Open. The way they do it is they have different teams. So they have like merchandise, sales and marketing, ticket sales and things like that. They empower every different unit of the organisation to think about what they can commit to around diversity. So one of the things this year, for example, is the ticketing sales. So when patrons try and buy tickets, there's often a rush, and I think phones and things. They've created a special line for people with disabilities and accessibility needs to be able to pre-access and get the tickets beforehand, so they're not having to wait ages on the phone and things like that. So that, I would argue, is a very good model because you're empowering everyone to think about how it impacts every part of the business and organisation. And then the sixth and final one, evaluate. So come up with a basic evaluation framework, or we're starting here. How do we know if we've improved over the next 2 or 3 years? What can we actually take to, for example, the board? So one of the reasons that prompted the US Open, the United States Tennis Association, to do the project is, yes, they saw me do it with the Australian Open, but they have board members and sponsors, multi-billion-dollar sponsors, who said, if you're doing this work, we need to see it works. We need to know that it has a return. And we're seeing that a lot more now, where if people are giving money or supporting something, they need to know it's having a return and it's having their intended outcomes. So you need to measure the success, and you need to adjust strategies as needed. Again, so sometimes I'm under pressure when I do program evaluations to show something works so that somebody can access funding again. We need to move away from that, because even if you have $1 million and you have something and it hasn't worked, that's fine, because you know not to do it again. Everything can't be perfect. You might change it, but we need to move beyond just showing something is positive for the sake of it when actually that's not the case. And if you do something or something doesn't go to plan, that is fine, because you know to do it, because there's no point in just keep doing it for the sake of it when you know that it's actively not helping your organization. Right, we're going to have... Thank you. So we have a activity for you to do in your groups now. We're going to spend about 20 or so minutes on it. And it's to get you to think about and have some discussions around what are perceived, or what do you think are the basic minimum standards that your sport or organization can commit to for diverse groups. So it could be around psychological, cultural safety, experiences free from discrimination. I want you to think about the 5 kind of key groups that we're working with, especially in the context of the inclusion plans and the TMA funding. Think about what are the basic minimum standards that these groups can expect or they want from their sport experiences. And you can draw on your own experiences or the work that you've been doing along your diversity journeys, but it's more about the minimum standards. So there are obviously things that you can aspire to do, and it would be great to get to and to achieve. But have we missed, or maybe we aren't engaging with some of the basics, let's say. So what are the basics, or what are the minimum standards that you could try and include in your plans to ensure that diverse groups have those basic minimum standards of inclusion? And however you conceptualize it is completely up to you, but have some discussion, share some experiences, and maybe list a couple for each of the kind of key areas that we've identified there, because across those 5 areas, you'll have 3 in the inclusion plan, you'll have a separate RAP and gender equity plan that you will do. And after this activity, we'll go through those specific plans. But for this next activity, have a discussion and jot some of them down, and then we'll share some of those. Because again, with the plans, you don't need to do too much, and you don't need to try and achieve too many different things. Think about what are some of the core things that you could do well to ensure that these diverse groups are included and have that sense of kind of safety and belonging within your sports. Okay, I'll give you about 20 minutes. So just hold it there for a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the axes of disability where I got a table to talk about what they discussed. But I thought we'd start with just generally, are there any things that came up that you found were kind of universal or could go across different groups? Yeah. Welcoming environment, excellent. And what might a welcoming environment look like for you or a team?
A welcoming environment, it's when whoever comes in, somebody says hello, they make them feel welcome, they discuss things with them, find out what they'd like to do, and you go from there. So basically, you are not judging them from when you see them, you're offering them a welcoming face, and you continue to offer them somebody that will lead them into the club. So
Perfect. Excellent. Yep. Can you just repeat that once more in there? Sorry.
Consultation with the actual group or community concerned.
Yeah, so consultation is a really big and important one. You need to be given an opportunity and a platform for people to engage in discussions and feedback and share their experiences. Yeah. Any other things general across the board? Yeah. Oh.
Visibility. So, like, if you're creating an educational resource, do you have a photo of, a child using a frame, multicultural images, and so on?
So representation is really important. The idea, if you can't see, you can't be. So you need to see yourself represented in marketing and imagery and those type of things. Yep. Anything else, General Tanya?
Safety and psychological safety included in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Some at the back there.
Adaptation and modification of rules.
Yep, absolutely. So modifying games and rules, especially I think for youth audiences as well. Yep.
We were trying to be positive here, but also many of the sports face unsuitable facilities, but the facilities are not within their control. They're in control of local government or some other body. And so that's constriction on everybody.
Yeah, really important point. Clubs can't be expected to build new multi-billion-dollar facilities, etc. So sometimes it's about adapting or engaging with certain communities to understand what accessibility requirements can be adjusted or made. Yeah. What we'll do now then is I'll get a table to share some of the key things that they kind of discussed. And with these, again, there's kind of no right or wrong answers, because again, with this type of work, different people experience different things. You could say, what's your experience of sport being like? And 10 people tell you 10 different things, okay? But in terms of people with disabilities, any table like to offer some of their discussions and things that they discussed for this particular group?
Overall, we kind of said that a lot of these things that we discuss will go for all groups, but for people with disabilities in particular, a big one is, well, a challenge we've had at Football Victoria is getting clubs to understand that people with disabilities is more than just setting up goals and putting a ball. They also want to develop their skills. They also have elite pathways, whether it be to Paralympics or intellectual disability games. So kind of having that pathway offerings there, whether it be a member federation or a club, that was probably one of the biggest things. And then I think someone said it before, like modified equipment rules, and really just being understanding, how can I make it easier for you to play this sport? There is two. And the last one would probably be, again, just visibility, like whether it be social media or whatever that looks like, just really putting it out there to show, hey, we see you, and yeah, being really loud and authentic with it, like we discussed before as well.
Great. And there's an organisation called Access Keys. I'm not sure if anyone's worked with them, and they do a full accessibility audit of facilities. So, for example, if you have a person with a disability, whether it's a leisure facility, sport, etc., they do a full accessibility audit and do an access key so that they can access information beforehand to know, for example, where is the car parking space in relation to access what facilities, whether they have hearing loops and those type of things. So there's obviously a range of things around accessibility, but again, it's trying to think about what are some of the kind of key basic requirements that we might cater for people with disabilities. The next one, LGBTIQ+ communities. Anybody have some discussions or thoughts around the basic standards for that community? At the back there? It doesn't have to be one table, we can mix it up.
I had first to engage with local community to make sure that we have safe and welcome places. Non-gendered events, inclusivity shown on the website, and mixed heats and finals, uniform, regular, mixed podium.
Great. Excellent stuff. I think Tanya had something.
Yeah, one thing we had to add to that was just the strong governance in terms of your policies and processes, and that went back to something you were saying, earlier, Ryan, around if you don't have that in place, then that's when things can fall down. So, yeah.
And in terms of that specific community as well, I know my own experiences, for example, playing tennis. If I'm playing tennis in a new club or a different venue, and I might get questions, for example, around do I have a wife or children and things like that. So sometimes it could be as simple as understanding that within your sport club, not everyone is heterosexual. I might not have worked it out yet, but having those conversations, it doesn't necessarily exclude or make people uncomfortable, because often they might not be doing it with malice, but it can make me feel very uncomfortable, and I don't want to have that awkward conversation in a lot of different areas and avenues. So even just trying to guide conversations to understand that club and members aren't necessarily always from the same community, and that they might have different experiences. So I think being seen and being heard, and one of the things that came up in some of the research was that young people in particular feel like their identities are questioned and challenged a lot. So young people just want to be able to play sport and not have their identities questioned or challenged and validated, those type of things. So it could be really as simple as some of those things. It doesn't necessarily have to be big, grandiose things. Just small gestures can make positive impacts. Yep.
I forget the term for it, but I feel like it's a kind of elephant in the room question. With the LGBTIQA, communities, when it comes to the mixture of the cold or multicultural people with different languages, the First Nations, there's a lot of religious and cultural beliefs that come into it. Now, in Victoria, we can't have women's only as a rule for a lot of sport. We can't have men's only as a rule for a lot of the transsexual community. It wouldn't be fair. Okay? However, having the open leagues, mixed leagues, things like that is an option, but it doesn't provide a culturally safe element for, say, a young Muslim girl, for example, who wants to play sport. It doesn't have a culturally safe element for a First Nations individual who doesn't want to participate with males because that's not the done thing, you know what I mean? In that type of landscape, it becomes very, very tricky to navigate, and it's a minefield, it really is. What is your advice to those groups out here who are dealing with that sort of thing? We want to encourage the cold communities. We want to encourage the diversity. However, those restrictions still stay.
Yeah, great question. I've dealt with a few issues and there's been a few legal challenges, for example, whether a swimming club can exclude certain types of One thing I'll say is, in terms of the law, one group's right doesn't necessarily trump another one. And we're seeing it now around some religious communities and LGBT communities where it's certain beliefs that they don't believe in certain things and they might not want to play with certain individuals. One person or one group's identity cannot stop someone else playing sport. You have equity. So, for example, if you have some young Muslim women who want to play in certain conditions, sports can work towards equitable practices to make sure that they can participate. But likewise, one group doesn't have priority over another group. And I've seen a few legal challenges where there's been some women's-only gyms trying to exclude trans women in particular based on religious belief. Now, they've been knocked back within the courts because when the Sex Discrimination Act, you can't legally exclude someone based on either religious identity and things like that over another group. So although it's challenging, we kind of need to work towards how can we cater and try and engage the different groups. But when it comes to it, and you have one group belief or identity stopping another group's participation, that's when it becomes a problem, because we live in a society where we have public spaces and everyone can access them. So there are challenges around there. The best advice I would suggest around working through those issues is engage the specific groups, whether LGBT groups, religious groups, and think about how you can work towards that. If it does become adversarial or too challenging, I would suggest going to the Victorian Human Rights Commission. They have team members who are working through some of these issues on a day-to-day basis, and they would be able to kind of help you. But if kind of takeaway would be, we need to try and work so that everyone has access. And if sometimes the structures within your sport don't work, you need to think about what can be done to do that. Because ultimately, under the law, you can't exclude one group on the basis of another group's identity. And that we are seeing it being challenged. So there's groups who are trying to introduce into Parliament the religious exemptions rule, so where you can legally, for example, exclude an LGBT person from a school, or a teacher can legally be fired because they're gay on religious beliefs, etc. So we don't have that currently, but there are measures to try and start that. But yeah, trying to balance different groups is difficult, but when one impedes or impacts the other, that's when there's a problem and things kind of need to be worked through. But happy to also have a chat afterwards as well. So, women and girls, who would like to offer some low-hanging fruit around women and girls, or basic expectations of working in an organisation or playing? Yep.
Yes, I'm the Women and Girls Participation Manager for BV, so this is close to my heart. But what I would say is equal access is the biggest thing. So scheduling and rostering, everyone goes, oh no, everyone's got equal access to courts, but you'll find all the boys' games are on court 1 on the show courts, and all the girls' games are out the back. So yeah, that for me is the biggest one, is like equal access to facilities and equal access to the same standard of coaching and the same standards that you would give to anyone else should be across both programs.
We will touch upon that in the next slide around the fair access policy roadmap from Sport and Rec Victoria, where the expectation is local councils have policies in place to address exactly what you've just said. Any other parts around gender? Yeah.
Melbourne City Council recently did the Fair Play Code, and one of the things that I brought up with them is fair play, number one. Yeah, okay, access for everybody fairly, but that also means that it's not just access for big sport, it's also access for small sport. And in that is the smaller programs. And as you say, the boys are on at 6 o'clock on show court, the girls are on at 9 a.m. out the back. That's not going to work either. So, yeah. So I don't know how many other councils have undertaken that process, but I do know the City of Melbourne have.
Any other bits around women and girls? Yep, we've got 2. Yep.
One of the things around women that I've seen in previous work we've done around this is that often they're carrying the weight of organisation of the family or organisation. So it's not just thinking about the court, the person and the player, but it's thinking about the support network that gets the access for the young people. So having schedules done well in advance, thinking about working parents and how they'll deal with it. And so it's thinking about the role of the woman or the role of the primary caregiver outside the sport that brings the people to the sport as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that around timing of events to meet caregiving and also mums and bubs programs and things like that.
Perfect.
Involving the whole family.
Yeah. And I've had colleagues at Victoria University who've done a lot of work around, for example, uniforms and colours of uniforms and those type of things that girls in particular want to be able to play and access sports that's comfortable for them and not have certain restrictions about what they can and cannot wear. So that's always a big point as well. Multicultural communities. Anybody have some basic requirements in engaging these communities? What you think they would expect from their engagement?
I think a big one is adaptation and awareness, cultural awareness. So being aware of different days or holidays, for example, when is Ramadan and when can you change the training times, or even like if you have sporting club with a Jewish majority community, you wouldn't go to schedule an event on a Saturday. So cultural awareness and understanding, but also just being mindful of the way different cultures are. That's probably one of the biggest ones.
So that awareness, really important. Anybody else? Yep.
I was going to say making sure your canteen has appropriate food. So you're not just having your sausage on the barbecue or your bacon and eggs in the morning thinking, and that's just not even for multicultural, just, people are vegetarian or vegan and no, they don't want their veggie patty cooked on the same plate you cook the bacon on. Small adaptations can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And I think as well there it's important around, recently there's been quite a few anti-immigration rallies and anti-immigration sentiment in Australia and across the globe. And it might be just checking in on some of those multicultural communities in your club saying, hey, we're aware that there has been things happening. How are you going? Is there anything we can do to support you? And kind of reaffirm support and commitment, because sometimes it really comes down to just being seen and feeling valued and being celebrated to be part of the club. Can be. And then finally, First Nations, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander communities. So ways that clubs and organisations can work towards reconciliation and improve experiences. Yep.
Hi, how you going? Look, we've had a fair bit of experience, I suppose, with this in that the particular sport that we do runs and competes typically in the forest. And so what's important for us when we seek to do kind of better in this particular space is to be patient and take the time to immerse yourself in understanding what they think about everything and what they think about their land and their health and their this and that. And understand that if you're going to do it, you need to be patient. They're not in a hurry to suddenly get to the result. They just want to show you who they are, and then you can improve who you are, and then we can get this stuff right spot, I suppose. So it's just to immerse yourself, be authentic, listen and be patient to get this stuff with them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Right at the front.
I've just sort of gone through a bit of lived experience with this with the Wathaurong down my area, and I was at a leadership forum and a person speaking was BJ O'Toole, and I said to him from a sports perspective, this is at a club perspective, what's the one thing we can do? And he said it starts with a conversation. And that conversation happened, led to one thing, another thing, another thing, and it keeps on growing and expanding. From that one, just listening to him about having a conversation. So it's and the results have been sort of his artwork going to a church and and we've got a new facility opening next week, which has got his artwork is going to be stitched into the hockey pitch. So as you run on the hockey pitch, every time somebody runs on, they're going to run past his artwork, And also it's led to a 15-year funding agreement with him as an artist by the council as well. So he's actually been paid properly for his work. But going backwards, and when he's actually been asked, it's all about the conversation to start with, and you don't assume.
Anything else? Oh, yeah.
We talked about how when one person comes, the whole family comes, and if one person has a good experience, then everyone does. But if one person has a bad experience, then no one does. So the importance of including families and also follow up so that there's like local people who are welcoming to kind of support ongoing engagement over time.
Correct. So some of you might have found that activity difficult. Some of you might have been through that kind of process before, but ultimately it's really important, and the next step of your kind of journeys and in developing these plans is to really engage in meaningful, deep community consultations. So one of the challenges I kind of give you is to ensure that you do host some type of community consultation. You can do it internally. Sometimes you can get external people to do it, so people might feel more freely to be able to express their opinions and experiences. But you really need to be hosting some type of consultation to understand what are the experiences, what is it like for First Nations people in our sport? Are there any specific barriers or challenges for certain groups that might not be for others? And I think it comes down to, again, just kind of listening, but providing that olive branch and opportunity. A lot of people from diverse communities and research projects I've done always say, thank you for this opportunity for me to be heard, because often they don't get that opportunity or chance. So providing and actually giving people options and opportunities to provide that feedback is a really powerful tool and will help kind of build that trust and respect with those communities. So again, if you can take anything away from this activity, when you're designing your plans, think about what are the basics that we can do to start with and then potentially build upon them, because you're not being expected to try and do too much. If you're a small organisation with volunteers, you're in a very different position than a large sport with billions of dollars of funding and things like that. So understand kind of the parameters and context of your organisation and what might be achieved, but you're not expected to do too much, because it'll just cause challenges for you. Right, so I'm just going to briefly touch upon the kind of two plans. So in the next session, you're going to have more opportunity in the online session to share some of the consultation work you've done, but also share some of the things that you've done. You might have ran certain programs or done certain initiatives that have worked well, and then we'll probably get like an online board where you can share that and maybe share opportunities for people to say, oh, hey, I saw you did this. Have you got any tips, or how can I learn from that? So you can kind of share that information. But ultimately, in the inclusion action plan, so you're going to be given templates. So you've already got one template which will be sent round from Vicsport, which is just a template. So again, this is kind of the idea of the basic things that you should be doing and could be doing. And the gender equity action plan is coming, so you will have a template as well in the next few months. So you're going to have the templates to kind of guide your work. But again, think about them in a broader context of a broad DEI policy and strategy as well to help shape some of this. So the inclusion action plan, 3 key plans needed to access the funding. So an inclusion action plan, gender equity plan, and the First Nations or reconciliation action plan. And there will be another session being done on that. So the inclusion action plan should focus on 3 priority areas: LGBT, disability and accessibility, and multicultural, cultural and linguistically diverse inclusion. So you can think about that broad approach and whether, for example, your national sport might already have something in place. So, for example, I don't think it's in anymore, but cricket used to have a sport for all, and that was their diversity policy. And then the states kind of worked on that, but then they would do different things in different areas, whether it's all abilities, cricket, those type of things. So depending on the context of your sport, what's been done, what you need to do, you can kind of adapt. But in an ideal world, you'll have your broad strategy, and then you can just pick out the 3 key areas and put it in your action plan. So we're not like wasting resources or double dipping or doing 5 different things when you only need to do a few. Okay. So use Vicsport's inclusion checklist to help guide and shape your action plan. But what I would suggest is have the 3 areas, and then have some bullet points around some of the commitments or those basic minimum levels of inclusion that you think. And when you do your consultations, they will come up. You need to ask the questions of what can our sport be doing to ensure that you feel safe and seen and included. And you'll get a fair bit of feedback, and then you'll be able to analyse and look at and say, hey, it's clear from our community consultation what people want from us. So they're kind of going to be providing you with some of those answers. And then it might be up to you just to kind of shape them, put them into other policy imperatives, again, depending on what your national sport's doing and what's in maybe your strategic plan. You might already have directions within your broad strategic plan. You might already have a diversity policy and strategy. But if you're designing it new, just again, think about what are some of those basic things that can be done. And obviously in the templates, there's lots to kind of guide you, but use your consultations and insights from speaking with your communities to help drive some of this. Because especially if you're not from a diverse background, you might not consider or think about some of the things that diverse groups have to think about. And that's absolutely fine. But use that community consultation to help that. And again, in the next session, we'll focus on maybe more what kind of needs to be in it. This session is very much introducing things, getting you to think about the broad strategy and what type of things you can include in it. So the inclusion action plan again, Vicsport have 6 key areas that you can use to guide some of your work as well. And this can go across all the 3 areas. So governance, workforce, how to ensure you have a diverse workforce, whether that's volunteers, paid members, sport development and accessibility, communication, making sure that it's inclusive and inclusive language, communication around external partnerships, and if you're doing good work and you are inclusive, how do you communicate that to your broader sport? How do they know the good work that you're doing? And then monitoring evaluation, so how are you kind of providing that ongoing evaluation? And again, inclusion should be a central pillar, but you must address ways and efforts to combat discrimination and exclusion. So if your plans don't include something around how your sport is going to respond to or try and manage or minimize discrimination, it's going to be a missing part, because again, that is one of the key reasons stopping people from engaging with sport. So the gender equity action plans, again, there is a lot of different things that you can do, you can try and do, you can cover, and there's a lot of information out there which could be a bit overwhelming. Okay, so you're going to have the template from SRV, but ultimately you've got some key bits that you can draw upon to help inform your gender equity strategy. So for example, the first one, the Fair Access Policy Roadmap. I think all the major local government organisations have those policies in place and they're publicly accessible. So you can go on, have a look, see the type of things that they're doing, see some of the key areas, and you can use that to help inform and guide your gender equity plan. Likewise, you've got the National Gender Equity Governance Policy from the Australian Sport Commission. So that's governance principles and guidance on how to ensure gender equitable boards. So you've got that document, which is publicly available on the ASC website, again, to help you around the governance perspective. And then you've also got Our Watch which is around the sport implementation guide. So that specifically is around violence towards women, but a lot of the stuff there is broad gender equity with that lens added to it. So for example, I would strongly advise you to be looking at those kind of 3 key pieces to help inspire, get informed, which will ultimately help your gender equity action plans. You might have seen the scorecards from the WGEA, which is where they talk about the gender pay gap every year, and every organisation with a certain amount of employees has to provide that public information. And I think the gender pay gap has decreased slightly this year, which is a good thing. But from the reports, they found 3 key areas that they're suggesting organisations across the board focus on. And that was around safety, so ensuring workplaces are safe from abuse and discrimination. Improved gender balance, so having a balance of all genders at all levels, whether that's from the board, coaching. And then dismantling stereotypes, so breaking down stereotypes related to work, leadership, and caring. So again, those 3 key things would really help guide the focus of some of your gender equity work, because that's done from all the organisations which are large enough from across Australia. Just some things as well for you to take back to your organisations or when you're having your community consultations. It's kind of around philosophical pondering. So what role does your sport or organisation want to have in the world, in sport and in society? Sport has extensive reach to have positive social impact across all areas of the globe. Never underestimate the impact that you can have. I remember doing some work in Hobart, and I had some people, I think it was a time when Margaret Court was making some disparaging comments around LGBT people. And I had a lot of people down there because I think there was a media article about it where I was quoted, and they kind of said, oh, hey, thank you so much for speaking out about that. It's really important that we kind of feel represented and people are kind of talking about it. So sometimes with these action plans and things, they can really have positive impact on people's lives. You might not always see it, but don't ever underestimate the power that you have to improve people's experiences and improve their quality of life by feeling that they can be themselves and bring them their whole selves to the sport that they play. Consider, are you trying to educate the masses? Are you trying to impact diverse communities, or both? Consider opportunities to educate and inform and raise awareness, but not be too forceful. So often with, like, for example, some of the tennis days or Pride Day, All Abilities Day, are you doing it to try and attract those communities to the event, or are you trying to raise awareness in the broader society around maybe the rights of those groups? And you have to kind of consider that. So if you're doing an activity or initiative for a certain group and people resist it, why are they resisting it? How are they being impacted? And again, how can you include different groups, because they do need different things. There's a important approach to treating everybody the same, but then also you need to understand that certain times and opportunities, people do need different equitable opportunities to facilitate participation. And again, under pressures and constraints, are you trying to simply do the basics and be compliant? There's nothing wrong with that. Often sports are overburdened, have too much on, lack resources. It's very difficult to do some of these things because they're seen as a luxury. So when you are kind of developing your plans, is it just to get by, or do you want to have more impact? But have some of those considerations at the back of your mind when you're developing these policies, because you might know you would love to do certain things, but you know that you might not get round to it, or you might not have the power to do it. Just some top tips then for leaders or people kind of doing this work. Use data from your own sport and context to create and update your DEI belonging strategy, policy, DEI. Monitor and evaluate your efforts and initiatives. So when you do this work, think about what baseline measures you can use to see whether you're actually going to have an impact or the work that you do will have an impact. Use evaluation, research, insights, data to carve out your approach, which works best for your own sport. And resistance to DEI and equality advancement will be a central focus, which affects this work. So this work will get bumpy and you will have to deal with complaints, resistance, those type of things. That's part and parcel. And it can be very discouraging. But again, there is kind of support out there and there is approaches that you can use that maybe some sports have worked with and it been applied previously. So next step. So for the next session, which is a few months' time, a couple of things. I want you to consider what previous policies, action plans or approaches your sport or organisation has used. Has it been successful? Do you need to reinvent the wheel, or could you just refresh it, or could you just add some things to it? How can you build on that progress or direction? And it might be carving out something completely new. But think about what's been done in the past and what you can potentially do moving to the future. The second one is undertake community engagement and consultation. So this is critical to your plan. So in the next several months, to give you ample runway into the requirements, organise some consultations and community engagement. It could be done around events you're hosting. It could be done online. There's a variety of ways that you can do it, but for the next session, have some information that you can use and bring to discuss around the things that you've found from engaging your user groups and your different diverse groups. And then come prepared to discuss community and organisational feedback. And it might be you use the first activity you did around the fruits as a kind of icebreaker to ask other people in your organisation. Because often it might be a subcommittee, for example, who's tasked with this work. And in terms of having that icebreaker to broach some of those discussions, because it's not always easy. Some people find it difficult to engage in these conversations. Sometimes people might think they don't want to say the wrong things when they're absolutely well-intentioned. So understand that these conversations aren't always easy, but I think if you kind of foster that respect and trust and meet people where they're at and understand people do have different experiences and backgrounds, things like that. But it's really important to kind of start the conversation, because I think when you don't talk about something or you don't have that conversation, that can always do more harm than good. And you can do that yourself. You can get some external people. If anybody needs any help or advice and things, please get in touch. I'm happy to help. But there's just a little thing there from Muriel many years ago. She was onto a winner. You can't stop progress. So there might be a lot of people who don't always want this work to happen or will push back or resist some changes that you potentially might want to see in your organisation or sport. It's natural for people to push back against it. There's a lot of research and evidence that shows that the case. So when you are doing this work and you're developing these policies, it's not always easy. Just know that. It's not easy work. You'll have a lot of different people with different perspectives who have a lot to say. Some of them can be loud, some of them can be quiet, some can be forceful. Navigating it is not always easy. So just kind of bear that in mind. Otherwise, again, just a takeaway. Always remember, while there's resistance and maybe there are some challenges and things working through, ultimately diversity is something that should be and can be celebrated and seen as a positive thing. And I've had a very rich and meaningful life because of diversity. I've travelled the world, I've engaged with different communities, and I see diversity as a positive thing. And when people are able to engage and be part of their sport, it makes a big difference. And I'm a tennis player. I've played since I was 6. I used to be a tennis coach throughout university. And some of the work that Tennis Australia is doing in particular and tennis across the globe, it makes me really proud to be part of that sport, to know that my sport has my back and that it's an inclusive place. It does make a difference. But if you are ever having any challenges or things are getting hard, think about the narrative or the discourse of the type of conversation and try and gear it back to how can diversity be celebrated, how can it be seen as positive, and how can it improve our business and the way we do things. Because again, there's a lot of evidence to show that when diversity is engaged with and done properly, it can really benefit your business, whether that's through new participants